many of you have maybe had some acquaintance with, started to read Revelation and kind of stopped when you got to the part about the 7 seals or the horse of the apocalypse? Exactly. So, me too, and I understand that. And I think we're going to open this book up in a way that will really make sense to you and help you to understand it. I do. I really think we can do this. And I think I can even help today. Michael has helped me enormously, and especially with this translation. And I just want to tell you that the Archbishop of Canterbury, he used to be the Archbishop, he's not the Archbishop of Canterbury right now, but Rowan Williams, who is a really great intellectual, a man of tremendous learning, read the translation, and this is what he had to say. Now, you should know that Michael actually translated the entire New Testament, but specifically his translation of Revelation has been noted. He has a particular gift, I think, in that book. And Rowan Williams says this: "Good translations take risks and let you read a familiar text as though for the first time. This irresistibly colloquial and energetic version of Christian scripture keeps up a flow of linguistic vigor and sheds much fresh light. Both the narratives of the Gospels and the arguments of the epistles are presented with memorable vividness. And the rendering of the book of Revelation is a genuine tour," which it really is. He, I think, has done something here which is going to be deeply important. And my prayer is, frankly, that this class and my work with you and your work with us and my work with Michael is going to lead to another edition of the book with a new publisher. We have a publisher has it in mind, in which we can both present the text and help people who are looking at it to understand how to read it as they go along, so that it'll be more interesting. Now, the thing is that what we're talking about, you see your handout? The first thing I want to sort of think about, I want to speak for a minute about what we're sort of expecting in this class, actually. I think the first thing to sort of know is that it's really possible to understand this book. It's not out of the realm of our ability. And I think it's meant to be understood. I think John was trying to write in such a way in which people could take his revelation and understand it and absorb it. He wasn't trying to speak over people's heads, and he was not trying to confuse them. And we know this because of the way he speaks, specifically at the beginning of the book and throughout it. He speaks very much in the first person. He says, I'm on this island, and I was given this vision. And I don't know, I walked into this room, and I saw these candlesticks, and there were 7 of them, and they were on a table. And I don't know, I saw these candlesticks, and then after I saw the candlesticks, I met an angel, and then I went behind them, and then I ended up in a room, and I saw, I was taken, and I started to see this vision, and then he begins this trip that he makes into a whole new world. It involves a throne. It involves a discussion of words that are given to these 7 churches. He believes that in the vision, the 7 candlesticks lead to words to these 7 churches, all of whom he knows. And in each of the churches, he finds things that are deeply wrong with them, even though they're loving Christ, and also things that are right about them. And then suddenly he gets to a place where the vision becomes kind of hugely complex, with an angel with a scroll, and the scroll gets opened, and that's weird because he's scared to open it, but then an angel opens, and then he has another vision, and la la la, and at the very end of the entire story, which is kind of very beautiful. Let me just read the very end of this whole vision that he has. He says, and so that we have a kind of a feeling for his, a feeling for his, how much he wants us to get from this. I charge you now who hear the words of the prophecy of this book. If anyone adds to these words, God will heap on him the plagues here written. And if anyone takes away from the words written in the book of the prophecy of God, will take away the share of the tree of life out from the holy city. The one who bears witness to these things says, truly, I come quickly. It's very interesting, isn't it? So he really desperately wants us to take this seriously, what he said and what he's saying to believers, to the church. Now, I want to speak for a moment before we go ahead about translations. And then I'm going to get back to this kind of book. This particular work that Michael is translating, we want to just note a few things about it. That there is, in translation, he's translating from a text in which there are no chapters and no numbers. So, I remember my mother saying to me at the kitchen table, she was into the Bible, and I was majorly into the Bible, and maybe because she wasn't. And she said, I think it was 16 or something. She said, what the hell are all those numbers they stick on everything? 6, 7, Matthew 8, 5, John 6, Deuteronomy 4, 3. What a bunch of idiots, and these chapters that stick into things which don't necessarily correlate with ideas or a sense of anything. Well, she had a point, right? Well, they're not in the text. They're actually not there in the text that Michael was translating. There are no chapters, there are no verse numbers, not in the original. Also, the original text has the incorporation of other languages. As he is writing, you'll notice that Michael occasionally will go into a little bit of Greek, a little bit of Hebrew, sometimes some Spanish, Italian, sometimes Latin. And what you're going to notice, incredibly, is that as you read it, you'll know what the words mean. And you're going to be surprised because you'll think, how can I read Greek? But in fact, you'll find out that you can. You'll know exactly what it means. You will have read it before, you'll know what the author is going for, and you'll go, gosh, that's Alpha and Omega. Even though you don't know it says that, but you'll know it does say that. You'll see the sort of shapes, and you'll realize, gosh, I know what Alpha and Omega, or Lord, you'll see the Lamb of God written in another language. You'll say, gosh, that must be the Lamb of God, because you'll have seen it before. And he does that. He goes into other languages, because he's partly saying in his translation that this book is incorporating different worlds as they come into the sense of the book. So that's a kind of interesting thing about his translation. And he's not going to put numbers or chapters all over it. There are none. He uses contemporary vocabulary as much as he can. For instance, sometimes he uses the word, in one place he uses the word Irish cloth, rather than something they would have said in Asia Minor. He's deeply familiar with the sense of what the text is saying, and he's trying to give you a sense of what it's saying. So he's not, when something is visual, he tries to give you a visual memory, just like the text does. That's a kind of translation. And he also, he's not attempting in this translation to replace existing translations. From Michael Straus's point of view, this just, you should know, he thinks the best translation of Revelation is still the King James version. He really does. He says, in fact, he wrote me, he said, all that said, I'm not trying to replace existing translations of which the King James still remains the best, but rather make fresh what can sometimes be too familiar. So this is not a replacement. This is an attempt to be a teaching exercise for us when we read it. So this particular kind of literature is what we call literature within the apocalyptic and apocryphal kind of literature. Apocryphal works, if I were to say that something was apocryphal, usually when I say that's apocryphal, you would think it's a lie. You know, an apocryphal statement is a statement which is dishonest. But another way to think about apocryphal writings are writings that we see that are not to be used publicly in the church to inform doctrine, but they shouldn't be thrown away either. They shouldn't be completely disregarded, the Apocrypha, but they are to be kept. In fact, the symbol is in a kind of crypt and taken out and used to examine truths, moral understandings. So that's interesting. And as an apocalyptic kind of literature, apocalyptic we talk about like the end of times, our concern about what's going to happen in the end. And there's lots of literature that is about the end. In fact, we have, I was thinking about just last night, I was watching the news, and it was all about nuclear war and whether we're going to be close to nuclear war. And then there was kind of a funny piece about nuclear war, kind of a joke piece. But, I mean, imagine that. I mean, it's kind of like how many times a day are you confronted with something that is actually apocalyptic? Like, what's really going to happen when we lose all of our water? Or when the water covers over California? Like, do you ever notice that weather people get slightly apocalyptic? They really do. They can't help it now. They go, it's raining in Texas. And will it stop? Do you know, ever? You know, and you know, I find it interesting, I have to say, because in mathematics, one of the very interesting things you can do is you can look at like a span of, let's say, 100 million years. If you look at a span of 100 million years and you look at weather, you can see that a dip of a certain amount is what we would call trivial. I mean, actually, just saying. But not to a person who's living in Texas. But it becomes apocryphal and apocalyptic. It becomes apocalyptic to people who are living through it, right? So we get apocalyptic quite often, especially in tragedy, right? I mean, you know, when somebody says, I need to get a test for, I'm getting a test for cancer, they're doing a biopsy, you could get kind of like, what's the end here? What's going to look like in the end? Now, that's not a usual use of the word apocalyptic, but I just want us to notice how our mind goes there. What's the end? What's this going to look like in the end? Right? And what are we all going to be in the end? Now, as Christians, we just heard this sermon today about how somehow we're supposed to know the end already came and it's all right. I mean, that's what he said. I mean, you got any problems with that? Because it doesn't feel like the end came to me. In other words, Jacob preached that God has already died and we've somehow been, right? We've been forgiven. And we can live as though God entirely has put us right. But I'm still screwed up. Anybody with me? The Christians in these churches were having all the problems churches always have. They were fighting, and we're going to find that out from Revelation. You'll see what they were doing. They were sleeping with each other. There's a Jezebel woman who was apparently had a whole cohort. I was very excited about her. Of course, it's a woman. There's other people who are lording it over each other. There are people who've taken God out of the mercy seat. They're doing all sorts of terrible things in these churches. Now, they're nice people, too. You can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? And they're saying, well, when I thought Jesus had come, he died on the cross, he'd been resurrected. Now, he said he was going to come back again, but that hadn't happened. When was that going to take place? They thought, obviously, everybody thought, Paul thought it was going to happen very quickly. It didn't. And so if that wasn't going to happen, and they were already supposed to be okay, what's going on here? Anybody with me? Did anybody have a feeling, a little bit of a feeling, when Jacob was preaching today of, that's really good news, why can't I live in it? I think Jacob would have a lot of sympathy for us in that. I can really hear it. Why can't I live it? Right, Jacob? And that's why he's preaching it. In other words, I know I've been put right with God. Why is it that I can't completely be there? When's he going to come back and make it that way? So this revelation that John has tries to deal with this end of time issue of when is it going to be fulfilled, so that it's not just me living as if, but me entirely knowing and the world being put entirely right. Jesus' second coming. What's that going to be like? And it's fascinating, right? How to deal with that. Now, the interesting thing is that John says that what he saw, the thing about his prophecy, can't be described with words. And then he goes on and he describes it with words. So it's not linguistic, but yet he has to describe it. This is a fascinating idea, isn't it? Can't describe this, and now I'm going to go ahead and describe this. So he's going to use symbols in order to describe his truth. And these symbols come from the animal kingdom. There's animals in it, oxen and all these people. They come from the natural world, like earth and heaven. The symbols come from numbers, from time periods, from colors. There are black things and white things and red things. The symbols come also from weird and scary juxtapositions. There's a strangeness in them. They're cyclical. They're recapitulating. Anybody getting the sense here of what it feels like to have a dream? This is what dreams are like. Thank you. These are symbolic ideas, right? This is a truth that you've been there. You know, you have dreamt. You know what it is to be in this place. These are very deeply true things, but they're symbolic things. And what I keep thinking about is Andy Warhol and the soup can. Michael never mentions this in his work, but in this work, but he was the head of the Andy Warhol Foundation and was the person who very much worked to have Andy Warhol understood, and that foundation to lead to museums all over the world appreciating the kind of work that Andy Warhol brought into the world. And one of the things that we understand when we look at that kind of modern work is that it asks us, representational work, asks us to look at an idea. Like you see at representational work of, here's a field and there's a farmer. So I'm looking at a field and a farmer. That's really nice. The kind of work that Andy Warhol was doing says, you can't do that with me. When you look at me, you have to look at what you're looking at. You don't get to, this is a soup can that you look at, so why do you look at it? I'm a soup can, who are you? I'm going to be art that you have to look at looking at. You're making do you understand? So that's the whole thing about this kind of work. till the point where it becomes like a square, and it's like, you go, why do I have to look at a square? You didn't even work on that. That's not even a piece of art. And the square says to you, really? I'm not? Interesting. You are, however, standing in front of me looking at me. So suddenly you have to say, who am I looking at that square? This is the issue of a symbol making you look at you. That's what Revelation is about. It's a book that makes you look at you as it uses symbol. Anybody with me? So when you are looking at the symbols in this book, and as you read it, a question you're going to be asking yourself all the time is not, what does this mean? I.e., why did he have why are there like you said, why are there 7 candlesticks? Well, that's because there were 7 churches. You could get that far. But you know there's more than 7 churches. So then what you have to say to yourself is, well, what does that feel like to me? What does it feel like to me that there was something with lines like that, and that they extended to churches, and that it felt like a place? Like to me, when I read it, I thought, oh, the Eucharist, like the Eucharist. So what does it feel to you? That's a symbolic, that's a sense of your own, that imagery then speaks to you in a revelation. Now, ultimately, in this work, we come to an even more spooky place besides these symbols that I'm talking about, which is that finally we're told that there is no time. In the end, there will be no time. Time is going to not exist anymore. So all of the Bible that we've read, starting with Genesis, all the way through Daniel, we have a sense of time. What's the first line of the Bible? In the beginning. I think we're starting with time, aren't we? And says John in Revelation, he's going to say it numbers, there finally will be no time. Now, that means it's before the Big Bang. In fact, we know that there is no time before the Big Bang. So he's going to before the Big Bang. And the Alpha and the Omega is before and after time. In other words, it is before everything and after everything. So it's a piece about timelessness. Now, you know what that's like, don't you? That's a bit about what, in fact, Jacob, when he's preaching, when he says you're forgiven and you are entirely complete, although you actually walk around knowing you're not, that's a timeless statement. That's what we call, it's existential. I am and I am not at the same time is timeless. Are you with me? Yeah? For instance, when I told you 2 weeks ago about the fact that I felt this great love when my father was dying, I felt it for how long? 10 seconds? Maybe it was there 3 minutes? When he was 53, I was 24? How many years ago is that? I don't know. 40? It still gives me joy. It was 2-3 minutes. What kind of time is that? What does that say about time? So this book of Revelation is starting to make us understand time in an entirely different way. So that every single minute could be a year. And the birth of a little baby who dies in 10 minutes could be a lifetime. And the birth of somebody who lives. And you know what that feels like, don't you? Have you ever lost a loved one and you feel like I was only with you for a minute? And have you ever been with somebody for a minute and thought, I can't stand it, this is killing me? Right? And so we've got, now as this mystery that we're talking about, Revelation, end of time. As are also the beginning, which are also the end. How about that? But we're playing with ideas and concepts and symbols, really, actually, to validate, because you already know much of this. You have already known in your life that time is not, how do you say it, even. You know that. You know that there are certain moments in life that are astounding amounts of space in your head, and other moments in your life that are lost. Right? Now, how is that? Is that just because it's true of all of us? What do you think? You guys are laughing. So that is true of prophecy, and it's true of this idea of revelation. For a long time, people thought that art was descriptive. It described something. Like if you're painting, it was supposed to be about something. And then came right? And then, and as you know, like, and then even there was like a vanishing point. I mean, it got very strict. There was the back and the front. And if you were in Japan, they had their own way of thinking about composition, but they still had one, and they were very strict. And all the paintings had to look like that. You know, if something was closer to you, in your Japanese, it's smaller. And if it's closer to you and you're American, it's bigger. And that's just it. And there's a vanishing point, and that's it. And you draw lines to it. And blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden, Impressionists got a hold of prisms, and they went, oh, it's more interesting than that. There's light. And they started to play with light, and they took over the whole school in Paris, and suddenly, bam, you couldn't sell any of that other stuff. You could only sell their stuff, but the sad part is some of them were dead by the time that got figured out, which is my own thing. But anyway, then you get Impressionist painting, but it's still about something. I mean, even Matisse, he's got a woman on a chair, and yeah, he's using light, and it's very exciting, and it's not all representational completely, but he's still, and maybe her is 8 feet long because he wants it to sort of wrap around, so that's nice. He's playing with that a little bit, but it's still a woman in a chair. Right? Describing something. So if you think about that in biblical terms, it's still King Uzziah who died on a mountaintop. But then there's a departure that happens in art, and that is to ask the question, to be symbolic, which had already, by the way, happened in Russia, for instance, with icons, had already happened in the church, which was to say, but I'm trying to answer this question, was to say, isn't there a deeper place we can go, which is instead of having this painting be about something that you understand, but actually have this painting ask you a question. And in fact, ask you a question in such a way that it refuses to answer. It makes you nervous because it will not answer your question. You have to answer it. Does that make sense? So I'm going to give you a symbol, and you got to look at that symbol, and it's your problem, not the paintings. That's why this class is kind of interesting, because we've got to a place in the Bible which is symbolic. We're a little bit into the twilight zone. Now, there are people who have tried to look at this book very differently, and so let's just spend a minute at that. You can look at this book other ways than how we're treating it right now. So, and you can reject this way. By the way, if you've ever been in the women's Bible study, maybe some of you can't be in the women's Bible study, but you know there are many ways to skin a cat. This is the way I'm skinning the cat. I'm interested in it right now. But I mean, that doesn't mean it's right. It's just the way it's what we're doing. You get me? There are lots of ways to look at these things. I disagree with myself about every 10 years. Yeah, I mean, 10 years ago, I probably would be very mad if I was sitting in a pew. Not to worry. Don't worry about that. Let yourself just go and enjoy yourself with this idea and see if it helps you. And if it doesn't help you, don't worry, because you'll forget it. Yeah, that's the way to go. Anyway, it is. I'm old enough to know that. Finally learned that. Took me a long time. Some people have read this book, and that's why I gave you that little handout, and sort of looked at biblical literature in a way in which they thought if they could map out particularly what he was saying, kind of make a real map of it, then they could figure the whole thing out. I love this one, Signs of the Times. That's little clocks. Do you see that one? Yeah, oh, it's up? Oh, good. But you've got it in your handout. So in this particular one, notice that, for instance, if you were to read Ezekiel 37, that will tell you precisely what happened to Israel in 1948, and that they were able to get the state of Israel. Because if you read Ezekiel 37, it says that people will go to Israel, and that must be what happened to Israel in 1948. If you read Ezekiel 38 through 39, that's when Russia became powerful and it became the USSR. And you can tell that, of course, exactly. The labor conflict is all spelled out in James. Are you with me? I love the particularly, you can find the One World Church in Revelation 17. So in other words, people sometimes have taken the Bible and sort of said, well, this particular prophecy means this particular event. It's a deep misunderstanding, I think, of what the point of this. It's asking the wrong question. I also gave you a picture of another graph, which some groups have lived with, this dispensational premillennial graph, and the dispensation premillennial graph is can be very scary. There are folks who really go by this graph, and you can see that there's the Great Tribulation is 7 years. And the temple is rebuilt, and there are people who are very serious about this great tribulation and when it's going to start, and rebuilding the temple. And that's a lot of the pressure that's going on now within Palestinian churches to rebuild the temple, to take over the Temple Mount, to physically remove people, Muslims, from that area so that the Temple Mount can be rebuilt. The idea also, and then of course Jesus will come back. At one point, I understand many people in the White House and in government, if they were asked, believed that if in fact, is that right? I remember if in fact, right, I think it was during Bush or something, that if in fact they could take over this area and get back that Temple Mount and get back, that Jesus would come back. They were dispensational premillennialists and making actual government decisions on that basis. So it's pretty scary. And then they got that, as you read this text, I hope that as you read it, my difficulty with this idea, and I hope yours will be, is that I think that it's a question of placing our own need on the text rather than letting the text talk to us. We often do that, don't we? We place our own need on a situation rather than letting the thing tell us what it wants to tell us. We try so hard in Bible study, I have to tell you, not to eisegete, not to tell the text, but to exegete, let the text tell us. So I think this sort of tells the text what to tell us, rather than, but look how incredibly serious people can get about this kind of work. The next one, the book of Revelation, one is I love this. This is incredible. This is the entire book worked out in picture form, as though somehow you could put it in a sequence. So this is see, there's this enormous desire we have in our lives for sequence. You know, don't we want that so badly? What is the first question? If I tell you that I have lung cancer, what is the first question everybody asks? I have lung cancer. I've just been diagnosed with lung cancer. What's the first question? Well, how long have you got? And there's another question, though. That's true. And did you smoke? Right? People, that's all. I mean, that's what, you're right, though. How long have you got is true. That would be a very kind question. But some people will say, did you smoke? They might not say it to the person, but they said to somebody else, did he smoke? Right? And I hate that question, you know. But anyway, it pisses me off. But here's the thing. Why are we asking that? Because we want to know, why did it happen? What's the sequence? Because if I know the sequence, then I can change the situation and I can get control. That's what, I mean, that is very much what Jacob was preaching about. If I can, this incredible desire we have for control. I could just get the sequence, I could get control. And so this revelation is trying to speak. That's why John is so important. And if this class is so important, if you can get it, I think it really is important for us, is the giving up of control. Letting the text speak to us. But it's very, very tough because part of you wants it to be, would you please be specific? Would you, the rabbis say a wonderful thing. They go, the Rabbi Hillel used to say, I love the 10 Commandments. It's wonderful, but they don't tell you what to do on Monday. Isn't that great? But I understand the problem. And John understands the problem, but he's saying, in a very serious way, you're going to need to deal with this problem. Stop complaining about it and start living into it. It is, in fact, our reality. It's the reality, so stop complaining about it. He's being a real coach. Stop complaining about the fact that the second coming ought to have come or should come, or that you really want everything to happen like that. And start living into Christ's actual teleological presence in your life now. Sorry, time is over. That's it. You really do only have now. That actually is true, and it's all happened. And I'm the Alpha and the Omega. And sorry, that's actually true. And the Twilight Zone is right, and the other stuff is not. And that's how it is. And stop the rest. Live in the truth of this, and Christ really is all there is. And that's all there is. Stop it. Don't try to reconcile this thing. You never will, because the other is false and this is real. He's really there. He's complete. He's on Patmos, man. It's over for him. He joined the Twilight Zone. And he's saying you have to do it too. And he's saying it to the churches. It's really interesting, isn't it? But it's amazing, related, I think, to love. Because truthfully, if you can live this way, if these symbols start to feed you and speak to you, you will not get, it's astounding, but it does in fact feed you with love in such a way that you won't want to sin. I mean, sin doesn't have a hold on you when you're filled in that way. You know, because you're just living each moment in Christ. And you're with me at all? I mean, in that? It's really interesting. Do you see why it's an interesting book? Yeah. So it's also, in that last bit, because I'm looking here, at the last bit, I just wanted to share with you the, see those paintings on the back? This book has there are many, and Michael's going to share many more with you, but Revelation has led to tremendous works of art to try to depict what people have gotten from it. And so, the bottom is the great Michelangelo. And that's kind of how he sees the world. And I guess what I'm really interested in is, the question is going to be, what does Revelation, as you read it, do in terms of how you see the world? What's your painting? What are your colors? What is your world? That God, you're the only, you are a soul, and there is no other soul like you. And God made you, and you are infinitely marvelous and infinitely wonderful. And if time is gone, and God is the Alpha and the Omega, and God made you, and there is no time, the deep question is, what does the world look like for you? What is your Steve just told me this morning that someone we've been praying for and his family had passed away. But the astounding thing that happened was that he woke up knowing it. Now, I wasn't surprised. And the reason I wasn't surprised is I've known Steve for 30 years, 40 years, Jesus. And he loves the Lord. And he's in a mystical path. He's been praying. And I'm not surprised. I've known many people who knew when people died. The wavelength shuts off. You can feel it. I mean, I bet other people here have had that happen. And so we really do have a prophetic part, an infinite prophetic part of our life. But that's his. And however that came to him, it had a certain specific personal feeling. I don't have it. It's his. So the deep question has to start to be, what's yours? What's yours? Because that's what this book wants you to have, is your own. I mean, you'll lose some of your self-consciousness. Yeah, if you're thinking, Shoemaker's right. If you're full of pride and you're thinking about yourself, or you get back into sequencing, you can't go there. But but John is loving. I mean, he wants you to have this fullness in Christ. You know those kind of people that you can't upset. Right? The interesting thing, though, is that John, because this is Christian, see, John is upset. He yells at these 7 churches. In the vision, he's mad at the 7 churches. And I saw a beautiful actual example this morning of what I felt was a real Alpha Omega situation. A man who comes to church was talking to me about being on his bicycle, and a guy came out and and he swerved to miss him, and he almost killed himself. But the man got mad at him and actually followed him 4 blocks. Can you imagine? And he didn't even know the man was following him, and he started to lock up his bike, and the man threatened him. And the man said, and they'd sworn at each other. They'd sworn at each other in the street. The man had sort of said, and he'd said, but he didn't realize the guy followed. So anyway, he followed him. He's locking up his bike. The guy said, let's take care of this right here. He wanted to fight him. And the fellow, was at the 9 o'clock service, said to him, what are you talking about? Why are you, I saved you. I swerved to not hit you. And the guy said, no, you swore at me. And he said, you swore at me first. And the guy said, I know I never swore at you. And he said, yes, you did. And he said, we're going to take care of this right now. And the guy looked like he was really going to fight him. So then the guy said, I'm going to call 911. And then the first guy said, no, I'm going to go. Oh, no, then the guy who was going to hit him ran. Duh. So then the guy who'd come to church, he said to me, I feel bad. I shouldn't have sworn at him. And I shouldn't have, I should have just been kind. And so I thought at first, yeah, you should have. What's wrong with you? I was thinking that in my head, like, what are you doing fighting with people on the street, you fool? Just like ignore him and tell him he's right and run. What are you, stupid? But then I thought, wait a minute. You actually talked to this guy. And I thought, if this guy were your kid, that's exactly what you'd say. You swore first, right? And you'd say, listen, I tried to save you. And you look him in the face and you'd really do it. And then if the kid kept going, you'd finally say, look, I'm going to lock you in your room. I can't deal with this anymore, right? But you actually interacted with him, when most people would have just run. So I said, actually, I'm not sure. I think maybe you're being hard on yourself. Maybe you really loved this guy. That's kind of wonderful that you interacted with a big, strong, macho person who could have killed you. In a way, you had an encounter. And maybe he'll think about that because you really talked to him. And actually, you risk your life to do it, just noticing that. But then I thought, isn't that an astounding piece of love? That this man risked his life to really speak to a person who was hostile and angry and crazy? And that maybe that's the first conversation this person has actually had where somebody confronted him face to face and really talked to him. And this guy's a fancy, intelligent man, and the man who was following him was in poor clothes and not his same race. And I thought, that's interesting. So why I'm saying this is that John does not say that you're supposed to walk around like a guru in this book. Just notice that. There's tension and activity. When the angel wants to open up the seal, he's like, I'm not opening up that seal. When the church is doing wrong, he's like, they're all going to burn. And it's later that he learns they're not. So notice that, just notice that it's not about you tampering down your feelings or being less energetic. That's not what it's about. It's not about being cool. It's about being fed. Yeah? Is that interesting? Yeah, I think we're done. I've given you a lot to think about. Your assignment is to get on your phone and read it.
Can I just say 2 things?
Yeah, absolutely, because maybe yeah.
But I do want to share a couple of stories, especially with some of the dispensational stuff that's gone up on the wall. And a lot of that is when you read the book of Revelation with, estimating when, the end is going to be. That's when you read the book of Revelation in your right hand, and then the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, because that's much better, in your, that was a joke, she said it probably, but anyway, in your left. And that's not what the book of Revelation was intended to be read by. And I'll tell you, I got swooped up into this this kind of stuff for a long time, and was like, oh, are they the locusts, they're Russian helicopters, immersing on Syria and all of this, and you hear these things and these images. And we had, when I was in seminary, a priest from the Sudan stay at our house. And he was taking a class on the book of Revelation. And this man, when he was 12 years old, his entire village, including his parents, were killed right before his very face. And they burned his village, and he belonged to a group called the Lost Boys that walked a bajillion miles to Kenya, where they were raised in orphanages, basically refugee camps. And I asked him, I was like, so now how do you read the book of Revelation? Wow, there might be someone else beyond just the United States that might have an idea on this particular book. And he said, he was like, well, we read it in a lot of ways, but at the end of the day, we know that Jesus is at the end and he's victorious. And this is what carries me through. And and I think that, as Janet pointed out, it's very powerful. All of us are going to face apocalyptic moments. You're going to get a diagnosis. You're going to get some bad news sometime in your life, and it's going to seem like everything's coming down. And so Revelation gives us a picture of the big, and know that God is in control of the big, so that we might be able to give him control of our lives, which is actually the small, and know that he's sovereign and over it all. And if you want, at the end of the series, I can share with you when I lived on 71st in Lexington, and I had the biggest rat on the planet Earth in my basement. And I can share with you how that is an apocalyptic moment and how that relates to Revelation, but you'll have to come to the very last class for that one. But I want you to know that in many and various ways, God has spoken to us through the prophets. The author of Hebrews opens up. But in these last days, well, that was 2,000 years ago. In these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son. And then finally, I want to say that when foreign policy is determined by dispensationalism, it causes a lot of havoc. And a lot of this stuff that has been, it's legit. There's some well-meaning folks that hold this. But when it gets shifted into foreign policy, it causes a lot of havoc. And some of the oldest Christians who live in the Middle East are being forced out of their land and out of their homes because of the massive misinterpretation of the book of Revelation. So what I'm hoping is that Janet's class, along with Dr. Straus, is going to give us a way to understand it, that sees it as a moment that's happening, has happened, is happening, and will happen, and speaks to your very life. And so I don't know, that just kind of hit me, because the Protestant seminary, the Protestant cemetery in Jerusalem, which is actually run by the Anglican Church, was vandalized this last week. And so by settlers, and this stuff is like very, very serious. And so, but I hope it just comes right to you and speaks right where you're at. And indeed, listen to that point that Janet made. This is a book that comes to you and says, look at you. And there you'll see Jesus with it all under control.
Thank you. Thank
but
you.
I do want to share that rat story.
Thank you. Yeah, I know, that will be exciting. That'll be exciting. Well, listen, you're wonderful, and you've been in Ireland. Yeah, for coldness, so good for you, yes. Oh, sorry. Michael Straus is a fellow who actually was in Bible study in New York City at Grace Church when he's in his 20s. It was in his first, but then he became a lawyer, and then he is just very smart. And he started studying ancient languages, and then he got his PhD. And then he started, this is all for himself, and then he started doing these translations, both in Spanish. He's also fluent in Spanish. He does Spanish translations. He loves translating. And then he did this translation, and he is offering this work. That's it. He's not anything. He's not a professor. He's a Christian, like a parishioner. And he's also an attorney. And he's just flying here to do this, and he's very kind of him. That's it. Yeah.